Hi, my name is Juan Tremino. My pilot study focuses on post-secondary education specialist student outlook. What that means is that I'm trying to gain a little bit more information on how to better prepare students for life after K through 12. Most of my research prior was focusing on student perspective as well as teacher or case manager perspective. Now I really want to look at those that work closest with the student in the Disability Resource Center at colleges and universities. So those are who I interviewed. Those are who I built this case study around. I wanted to try to see what they saw in terms of how prepared students are, what they lack, and overall what we can do better to help students that we currently work with prepare for post-secondary transition. Um, when we talk about why this pilot study is needed, we really need to look at the data that shows that roughly in California, 11% of students that are in post-secondary education enrollment are disabled, as well as the fact that there exists a disconnect between what we're doing in high school or K through 12 versus what we see in college. Um, when in high school we have the IEP, in college we don't. It's built around the Disability Resource Center, and what we're seeing is that students come into post-secondary institutions ill prepared to advocate for themselves or with very little information on how to get their accommodations. When we look at the percentages of students that are enrolled um, in post-secondary institutions, we have around 19.4% of these students being students with disabilities in the undergraduate area and 11.9 being in postbac. Um, that's a lot of students. And if we don't understand how to prepare them in a more efficient way, we're really setting a lot of students up for failure. Um, so this shows how important um, gaining this information could be. My research questions were, what are current barriers that exist for students with disabilities in allowing for effective transition to higher education? My two sub-questions were, how do you accommodate students with disabilities, that being in the post-secondary setting, and what skills are most needed to be successful in this setting? In terms of my method, I did around 30-minute plus surveys, some being longer than others. My initial interview I feel wasn't as effective as my other four. I used Axio coding and in vivo. This was a case study. I had four themes in terms of my findings. In terms of my participants, I had five participants, all working in resource specialist positions in the post-secondary setting. Each institution has that department set up a little bit differently, so their roles were a little bit different, but roughly the same. When we look at my participants, all were from colleges in Southern California. We had three males, two females, um, with varying levels, years of experience, all from California, all working in a SoCal and then SoCal institution, and then I put their pseudonyms right there. In terms of my case selection reasoning, like I said before, I really wanted to obtain a new meaningful perspective within the realm of student support. I just wanted some new ideas in terms of how we could better support our students. What components are lacking in terms of our preparation of these students? In terms of my trustworthiness, I utilized triangulation, member checks, and I was very upfront with my positionality. So I just wanted to make sure that this data was something that I could actually use, something that was meaningful. In terms of my theoretical framework, I based everything around optimal resource theory and conceptual framework for self-advocacy done by David Test. For optimal resource theory, this is an anti-reproduction perspective that assesses the influence of internally controlled micropolicies and micropractices on positive student outcomes or personal development. And in the conceptual framework of self-advocacy by David Tess, he really tried to break down what self-advocacy is for students, and he broke it down into 4 components, which I really liked. He said there was a knowledge of self, understanding one's strengths and weaknesses. There was the knowledge of rights, understanding what students are able to access, what they have the rights to do, what they're enabled to do. Communication, this is them being able to vocalize their needs, and leadership, which he considered to be the least important in terms of self-advocacy. In terms of the breakdown of my findings based on the research questions, I subsetted both of my sub-research questions into 2 branches and then had 2 from each. So in terms of the research question or the sub-research question of what skills are needed to be successful in the setting, we have essential skills and academic skills. And in terms of how we accommodate students with disabilities, we have student support, that being how the setting supports its students, and student expectations. This was an area that came up in which it talked about the expectations the students have coming into post-secondary setting from high school or their high school experiences. In terms of essential skills, there were some interesting things that came up. What I saw was that self-advocacy was rarely directly stated, but often alluded to. So if we look here, it says, if you do not meet with the student, this is a quote from one of my interviews. These are all quotes from my interviews. It says, if you do not meet with the student, it could be worth asking them to summarize their needs. Something like, it sounds like it is best for you to have course materials in both written and audio form. Is that correct? Also, while I don't directly ask a student the nature of their disability, I usually say something like, the more I understand about what you need, the better I can help you. Now, when I hear conversations like this, I think of my students that I have and whether they'll be able to have this conversation accurately or efficiently. A lot of my students are afraid of conversations like this, and I really think of self-advocacy when I do this. Are we giving students ample opportunity to have these discussions before they enter post-secondary setting, or is this something that's going to be blindsiding them, something that's brand new to them? In one of my other interviews, it came up that it said, but as a professor, it's not your place to say which pre-approved accommodations a student does or does not need. It is important to phrase a question, not a statement. Something like, this is a breakdown of exactly what this assignment is. This is what it's worth. What accommodations should apply to this? Student accommodations offices often have problems with professors denying student accommodations when they're entitled to them. This is something that surprised me because it's something that I see every day in the K through 12 setting that I currently work in. And to hear that this is something that's still prominent in the post-secondary setting was a little alarming. And it's it, it's kind of worse to an extent because what I did get back from some of my interviews was that they were saying that the teachers, or some of them were saying that the teachers do have a little bit more power here. They're able to say that these accommodations lessen the academic integrity, and because there is no IDEA, they can make that argument. So if a student's not able to accurately self-advocate for themselves, um, that which is the essential skill that's needed for success in this setting, then they're going to struggle in getting these accommodations. Um, Another quote that came out of this was, when you live your life with any sort of disability, navigating the world is a constant game of advocacy, and it's exhausting. Being told that you don't need something when you do, even from someone meaning well, is heartbreaking and can really make a student feel like their disability means that they will never be good enough. Most people with disabilities don't realize that, so I think it's a good reminder to have. That was the only statement I believe that said explicitly advocacy. Um, this was one that stood out to me. Um, it says, having accommodations doesn't give a student carte blanche to do whatever they want. It often requires a conversation with a faculty member in advance to ensure learning objectives are met. and requests are reasonable. I'm willing to bet you didn't talk to your professor before the due date and time. Can't do that. I'd have also given you a 0 on the assignment if I didn't know what was going on. When I hear situations like that, again, my students come flooding to my mind, and I start thinking about how many of my students this is going to be. Um, if we don't prepare them to do this, if we don't prepare them to be more proactive in terms of receiving their accommodations, it really shows me that the essential skill is self-advocacy. If they don't have practice doing this, again, they're going to struggle. In terms of academic skills, this kind of, it ended up being this theme of things that they do to demonstrate how important academic skills is, and in the sense that accommodations, although vital, do not substitute for being able to be um, academically up to par. Right here it says accommodations are normally agreed to up to the point in which agreeing to the accommodation would jeopardize the integrity of the course or the student's abilities to reach learner objectives. Simply because a student presents an accommodation to the professor does not mean that the professor is obligated to accept it. For example, imagine if a student presented an accommodation saying they could do absolutely no homework. It would not make sense to agree to it. In an instance where it seems unreasonable, have a conversation with the accommodations officer. Um, and then I had one quote right here where they said, I once had a professor share with me how they felt about accommodations in college. They said something along the lines of, I always work with my students to follow their accommodations and I never show any sign of annoyance. However, I'm not really sure I agree with some of them. I have few students with extra time on tests in a private room, but these students are pre-nursing and pre-paramedic. Some are even pre-med. I think that I think those work environments are way more stressful and way more distracting than a silent room during a test. How are they going to succeed when their knowledge is tested? Am I being biased and unreasonable? I feel like the system is setting them up to fail, but I guess the alternative is just failing them sooner. I feel so conflicted about some of these accommodations. Um, this really shows that because of perceptions like this, because of the way this institution is set up, it's going to be vital that students are able to have that academic backing in order to succeed because accommodations aren't something that are concrete. They have to be able to adapt to every challenge, and to an extent that involves academic skills. So it really shows that this is still something that's extremely important for success. In terms of student support, this is an area that came up. This theme focuses on the way the universities are supporting their students, and it was varied. From university to university, the stance it felt like was different. Much like we see in K through 12, the problem still plagues the situation. It's just every university, every college had their own way of doing it. So nothing was consistent, nothing was universal. Students receive accommodations, that being the only universal thing, but to what degree is varied. Um, we see here that it says your institution won't know about your disability unless you tell them. Your institution should have a department called the disability services or something of that sort. They provide a student with resources they needed to do. Um, they are needed to do best in school, including allowing students to take exams in a room with no one else, which helped immensely. Most interventions I have seen require lessening the burden of material. This does not help with the understanding and growth in autonomy. If we could point to empirical data that shows gains, we could reduce the lawsuits and much of the paperwork. From what I have seen, paperwork is to control for liability. So again, here we have the issue of compliance being the driving factor of accommodations. Um, right here it shows that it says faculty I've seen who have had issues with these accommodations ideally say they do not have time and a half in a job. Well, a job isn't an education. They are still entitled to an education even if they can't hold a job in that field for whatever reason. What I say doesn't really matter though. You have to comply with the law whether you think it's valid or not. So we have varying attitudes to accommodations. Some resource specialists are saying that the teachers must comply. Others are saying that there must be a discussion. And then others are saying that if the teachers don't oblige to the accommodation, if they don't agree with the accommodation, that they don't have to oblige to it. Um, this quotation goes over some of the accommodations that a teacher at their site did. So they photocopied the entire backing of the index, and it really was. They found it to be helpful because the student would be like on a test, they'd be like, "Oh, what was that P word?" They said, and then they would use the index to help them make up for that loss of memory or that gap in terms of that ability. Another comment towards accommodations was that if we taught in a system that was structured to truly support student success, we would care about the student's success in the long term, even when that means losing them as our students. That is not what it means, though. Instead, the bottom line is student retention, a metric that helps secure our funding. Um, Again, compliance and funding being the driving factor in accommodations. And lastly, it says, in general, universities have students with a variety of different disabilities, and there is no specific rule on which accommodations are and are not allowed. The accommodations are based on individual students' disabilities, not whether they will be required to take time limited high stakes exam in their future career. So the attitude towards accommodations being that regardless of the field they're trying to enter, the goal for the department should be to accommodate students to receive their education. Where we have other people saying that because we're preparing them for their professional life, these accommodations shouldn't be enforced, that they should learn to overcome. Um, it just comes down to training and education. A lot of these teachers, they're educated in their field, but they have limited education when it comes to working with students with disabilities. And we see that in K through 12. It's more of the same. Um, in terms of student expectations, what we're seeing is that students are coming to the post-secondary setting with unrealistic expectations. There is no IEP in college. The students have to advocate for themselves. A quote here that stood out to me was, sometimes students don't realize their college professor doesn't get all the details of the situation. They used to in high school where everyone knew their diagnoses and accommodations thoroughly, supposedly. They are usually open with what they need and why they need it. If I approach them in this way, it can help me understand how to accommodate them without being too aggressive. Um, Also, another quote that if I could remember correctly, that they had brought up was that um, they had said that a teacher who was adjunct faculty, they weren't able to get certain aspects of a student's disability, which held them back from fully accommodating their students, and that they weren't given um, the fact that they had a student with a disability on their roster prior to starting the class, and they found out day one. So that really institutionally limits the ability of the professor from accommodating students. Also in student expectations, it says right here, be sure to tell them exactly what you need, but be nice about it. If they're a good disability services office, they might even suggest accommodations themselves, like at the office my current college does. What this alludes to is that if a student is not able to advocate or directly state which accommodations would benefit them or what they need, then some disability resource offices aren't gonna enforce or advocate for you. They're not going to push these accommodations. They're really waiting for the student to be able to say what they need. Because if the student can't say what they need, there's a good chance they won't get what they need. Um, Again, we see here that they're talking about the accessibility plan, how they no longer have an IEP. They have a different term for it, but it just basically means that there's a system in place to help accommodate students. To what degree varies institutionally, department wise, student wise, even. when I reflect back on this study, what I see is that we're in the same ship. The ship's still the same, it has the same problems, but we're in different waters. In high school, I hear teachers saying, I don't want to accommodate or use these accommodations too much because we're not preparing them for post-secondary education. In college, the gist of it that I got was that professors are saying they don't want to accommodate too much because they're preparing them for the professional world, and accommodations don't go in line with that. Um, at the end of this, what I can say is that self-advocacy is even more important than I thought, and I already thought it was the most important thing. So it shows me that, yeah, accommodations are a thing, and even if the student is able to state them and say what they need, they then have to fight for that class per class. They still have to advocate for themselves, not only to the disability resource officer, but to that teacher as well in a much larger class. So the experience building aspect of transition planning really needs to be beefed up. I would think even from elementary school. Um, Another thing I saw was that there's no training. Um, teachers are, professors are ill trained in working with students with disabilities, as well as teachers are ill prepared for working with students with disabilities. So not much has changed in that respect. And a thing that would be interesting for me, I think moving forward, would be interviews for policymakers in terms of the way student support is set up. I want to know the logic behind a lot of this, how things could be so different from institution to institution, whether that be in K through 12 or college. Things are handled so differently. How does that promote equitable access to education? I don't think it does. So I think getting some insight into why this is set up that way, or what the logic behind this is, would be beneficial to overall trying to change transition planning, overall trying to change student support. Um, yeah, I believe that's pretty much it. So if there's any questions, I think you comment. Thank you.